from your perspective, what's the biggest threat facing America today?
I think it's a really easy question because it doesn't really matter what anybody's opinion is. And there's lots of opinions out there about what the biggest threat is. According to the Director of National Intelligence, which is the preeminent national security leader for the United States, the number one strategic threat to the United States is China. Everything else that you mentioned basically feeds up to a master umbrella that falls underneath of China. As China rises in terms of its geopolitical weight and success, as it rises in terms of its technological advancement, as it rises in terms of influence worldwide, all of the other secondary effects happen. You'll see more and more division and derision inside the United States, more and more pressure on the U.S. economy, less and less income that's coming from foreign investors and foreign buyers because they'll have an alternative in the Chinese market. Remember, the United States was built on the back of technology and financial markets. So as China develops its own technology and financial markets, it's creating competition in the global economy. That means that countries will be able to start doing business with China, where previously they only did business with the United States.
So would that be a fair lens, therefore, if you're trying to understand, every day there's a new splashy headline, some of them matter, most don't, but some do, and maybe it's a regional conflict in the Middle East or in Europe. Maybe it's something in the South China Sea. Maybe it's trade aggression coming from the U.S. Do you then step back and view that through the lens of U.S.-China competitiveness as you're cut out the noise, get to the signal filter?
That's exactly right. That is the only lens that matters. The lens of who is the top economic threat to the current national or the current global superpower. That is the only lens that we should have to look through. Because at any given time, there is a global superpower, a singular global superpower, the largest, wealthiest country in the world. And at any given time, there are only a handful of what we call near-peer competitors who are trying to catch up to that global superpower. It used to be the UK when England was the global superpower. It used to be Rome before that. So the world has always seen different superpowers. Even during the Cold War, when Russia and America were vying to be the superpower, or the USSR and the United States were vying to be the superpower, the United States was still ahead of the USSR. So you can always look at the world through that lens and have a very solid idea of what will happen next.
So how would you draw the scoreboard then if you were to analyze those two countries, United States and China, and come up with some kind of analysis about where the strengths are and where the weaknesses are for each and how they stack up against each other today? Because that is probably the most commonly asked question. You mentioned it, we've seen in the last 600 years, 5 empires come and go, right? It's now the age of the American empire, but that too will pass. The question is when and who will take the baton. So if you were to draft that analysis, what data points would you focus on and how do the two countries stack up against each other?
Yeah, it's a great question and one that we could go into deep minutia if we chose to. So I'll try to keep it general to start.
Sure.
So the easiest place to look is at momentum. Momentum economically, momentum fiscally, and momentum in terms of geopolitical influence. When you look at the United States' momentum, our momentum is declining in multiple areas. The power of the US dollar is declining in momentum. It doesn't mean it's negative. It just means it's not growing as positively, as quickly as it used to in the past. When you look at our momentum in terms of geopolitical influence, our momentum is decreasing. So we're slowing down. If you think about two cars in a car race, both cars are going fast. They're both going 200 miles an hour, right? But the difference is that our 200 miles an hour is kind of steady, or we're increasing at 2 miles an hour per minute. Whereas China, their momentum is increasing faster than our momentum is increasing. Fiscally, there's more wealth in China. There's a larger middle class growing in China. There are more and more world customers going towards China, towards their telecommunications, towards their electric vehicles, towards their technological solutions. China is continuing to increase its soft power in the developing world, whereas the United States is literally closing our soft power agencies like the Peace Corps and like the international aid that we've USAID that we've been focusing on for soft power. So you can literally watch as our momentum slows and China's momentum increases if you just look at those few indicators.
Now, the counterpoint to that, if I were to provide one, would say, and the momentum like strikes me as, I completely agree. You look at China from 1990s to today, it's been just a runaway train, right? I think it had the GDP of Italy in 1990, very poverty-stricken nation. 30 years later, top contender for global superpower. That's a trajectory that the world's never seen before, you know? And the Belt and Road Initiative they've rolled out over the last 15 years, effectively financing those developing nations, and maybe trying to like bring the next generation of consumers of Chinese goods online, but I think like strategic allies as well in the event of a US-China partnership. And 150 countries, I believe, took Chinese loans through the Belt and Road Initiative over the last 15 years. So a lot of allies in theory, but the devil's advocate point would say, yeah, but the demographics are a mess and everything has to start with demographics. And if there's no consecutive generations to pick up the productivity, like what happens? You know, they had a policy that governed their population growth for a long time. It didn't work out so well. And you can't undo that with government incentives and policy. They're trying, but it's hard. It's hard, if not impossible. So what's your take on that?
It's a flawed argument, the demographics argument. And I understand why you're saying it because there are many people who are parroting it. But the truth is, China is an overpopulated country. And the leadership knows that. It's heavily weighted towards the low productivity, low skilled, low educated populace. If you actually took away all of the old, uneducated, like poor manual workers, if you took that away and you only left behind the educated, highly skilled innovators, you would have a population that looks much more like the United States. So the problem that really is facing China is that the leadership, the Chinese National Party, the Communist Party, is trying to come up with how do we cut off the low productivity population and give our high productivity population a chance to take off. Because as long as you're carrying 1.6 billion people, your overall GDP per person is very small, right? So because every 70-year-old unemployed former farmer is taking a fraction of that per capita GDP. In the United States, it's not like that. In the United States, we have a much smaller population, so now our per capita GDP looks much higher. Even though you and I both know you can't compare a New York banker and their income versus a Alabama restaurant waitress. You can't compare the two in terms of what their earning potential is. But when you nationalize GDP over per capita, that's exactly what you end up doing. I believe that what China's really planning on is a mass event in the not so distant future that's going to significantly decrease their population. It could be an invasion of Taiwan. It could be participating in some kind of global war. It could be sending troops or sending people to support operations that are being carried out by partners like Russia, Iran, or North Korea in their conflicts. It could also be transforming their healthcare model so that aging and 60-year-old plus peasants in the countryside simply expire because they didn't have children and they didn't have the social support network to keep them afloat. In the United States, that sounds inhumane, that sounds monstrous, except that we had the benefit of a civil war to do that to us. Our civil war killed millions of Americans, drastically shrank our population, and then created this artificial increase in our per capita GDP.
As you explain this, I find myself thinking about something I've heard you say before, where you discuss how people think, inside their existing framework, right? We all grow up in a framework, and you used a shed analogy once. We kind of grow up and we live in the shed, and my shed's different from your shed. You may have some coincidental ingredients like my socioeconomic setting, maybe some intentional ingredients like my state hierarchy, right? The reason I went there is because what you said about China planning for some kind of a mass depopulation event is a hard thing to wrap your mind around, and it sounds so dystopian, right? But you stepped back and said, well, let's contextualize this a little bit. Could you go a bit deeper into that? And why would it be Why is it so hard for me to accept that that is actually a strategy that the Chinese administration may be thinking about and maybe even implementing?
Well, I think part of the reason it's so difficult is because we've already forgotten history. China already went through a mass depopulation event during the Cultural Revolution. And they're not the only ones to have done it. Cambodia did the same thing. Russia did the same thing. Venezuela did the same thing, right? When revolutions happen, sometimes a focus on those revolutions is eradicating a subculture within the country that does not offer a return on investment for where the country is trying to go. Whether that means they're targeting wealthy people, whether that means they're targeting educated people. Don't forget that there was a genocide between the Hutus and the Tutsis that happened in the last 50 years, for crying out loud. So we've seen these situations where mass population events have happened, and every time we see them, from an American point of view, we think it's crazy. We think it's immoral and unjust and unfair, but we still can sit there and watch it happen, right? In many ways, we could be watching the same thing right now with Israel's attacks against Palestinians in Gaza. And what are we doing? Of course, we're writing stories about it, and we're outraged about it, and we're writing posts on social media, but we're doing dick all to stop it. And that is a mass population event. Tens of thousands of Palestinians being killed in a small geographical area to transform the geopolitics and the demographics of that area for the long term. It's not as crazy as we think, but the problem is that the American mindset is very rarely focused on the past. We are a country that culturally is always focused on essentially the next 4 or 5 years. We look at 5-year goals and 4-year presidential terms. And, that's basically how we think. How long is college? 4 years. We just constantly think in this process. The average promotion cycle in the United States is 6 years. We don't have a long-term vision in the U.S. We're always focused on the here and the now and how we can move forward, which is especially funny when you hear the arguments about how Americans need to focus on, mindfulness in the moment. It's because we're so focused on the future, we don't learn from the past. And that's why it feels so awkward to us to say, how could this ever happen? Well, all you have to do is look in the past and you'll see how it can happen.
Yeah. I completely agree, man. Okay. So if I were to use your filter here, your China versus United States filter, and maybe analyze a handful of regional conflicts, I could look at the sort of series of coups in the Sahel region, and I think I get it. I could look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I think I get it. I could look at tensions in the South China Sea, and it's clear to me. It's less clear to me what's happening in the Middle East in terms of that U.S.-China lens. Would you be able to expand on how you process that conflict, Palestine, Israel, Iran, Syria, Azerbaijan now trying to play a bigger role in the Middle East, it appears. How do you process that through your U.S.-China lens?
So it's not really a U.S.-China lens. I want to flag this again. It's a lens of superpower and rising power.
Okay.
That's the true lens. Current superpower versus rising power. And the way that you have to look at that as it stands today, the United States became the global superpower in a bit of a nefarious way. It came out of World War II. And what we started doing was we started exporting forced democracy. So we demanded democracy from anybody who wanted to have access to the U.S. Economic market. If you wanted U.S. loans, if you wanted U.S. trade, you had to find a way to espouse democracy in your country. China was a democracy prior to 1949, right? The nationalist Chinese leader who fled to Taiwan was democratic by virtue and practice, right? So the reason I'm saying that is because when you look in the Middle East,
CIA believes that all people are born with a spy secret superpower. For some people, that means they can win deals. For others, they can spot liars. Some can even seduce lovers. I built a free 3-minute test to help reveal to you exactly what your secret hidden superpower is. All you have to do is click on the link in the description below, take the test, and start using your spy superpower to stay ahead of 99% of people.
you see a fake democracy. all across the Middle East, it's fake democracy. It's actual kingdoms and sheikdoms that have said they are now democracies when in fact they are still based on kingdoms and royal families. So they already know the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Jordan, or not Jordan, I'm sorry, Oman, Bahrain, these oil-rich countries in the Middle East, they fully understand they're not really democracies. Not everybody has a vote. They don't really get a choice of open elections, but they put on this show. It's a very pragmatic relationship between the Middle East and the United States. That pragmatism being, of course, oil. The United States needs oil. The Khaliji nations have oil. The United States can say all sorts of bad things about Khaliji countries. President Biden did. He called them all sorts of terrible names and promised that we would break off relations with Saudi Arabia because of the travesties they have against human rights. But we didn't, right? Instead, he leaned closer into Saudi Arabian relationships, and you start to see an increase in the trade and the sales of American weapons to the Middle East. So the superpower understands it needs the Middle East. China, the rising power, understands that the centerpiece of oil, of natural resources and crude oil for the future is still in the Middle East. The problem is that ideologically, the Middle East is far more in tune with China, thinking pragmatically, thinking practically, thinking through a lens of kingdoms and fiefdoms and rule, much closer to that than they are to the idea of democracy or the promise of democracy. So when you look at that superpower, rising power relationship and you compare it to what's happening in the Middle East, that's what you're really seeing. Practicality versus ideology. And the Middle East is far more practical than it is ideologically aligned with the United States.